Cool. So, yeah, I'm Joe Carlsmith. I work at Open Philanthropy, and yeah, I'm going to be talking today about the essay series that Scott mentioned, Otherness and Control in the Age of AGI. And in particular, my goal here, we'll see how well I achieve it, is to try to distill down the core thread of this essay series. So it's quite a long essay series. It's not an especially kind of focused, punchy essay series in terms of its thesis. It's more of a meditation and exploration of a bunch of different threads. But as a result, I have some question mark. Maybe people don't have a like, what even is this essay series even about? Even people who've read the whole thing. So I'm going to try here to say in a single lecture the at least one of the core threads that I see the series as exploring. I will say though that some stuff is going to get lost. Well, for one thing, the series in general makes the most sense when viewed in response to a certain kind of discourse about the existential risk from artificial intelligence, and in particular, the discourse associated with thinkers like Nick Bostrom and in particular, Eliezer Yudkowsky. So these are two thinkers who have done a lot to popularize the kind of possibility of misaligned AI destroying the world or kind of causing human extinction or other forms of human disempowerment. That's what I mean by AI risk. And the way that they talk about it and frame it, I think, has had a lasting influence, including on me and on the kind of the way the discourse is now. If you haven't been exposed to that, it's possible that some of what I say will like make a little less sense. My understanding is this is very early in the course, right? This is like the first guest lecture. Right. And you've read the first essay and the last essay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm going to try to summarize the discourse as I am reconstructing it and how I'm understanding it. It's possible some of this will be less resonant depending on your familiarity with what I'm responding to. But hopefully it'll be productive regardless. And if you do later go and engage with this discourse, I'm curious if my characterization ends up resonating. Also, as I said, the goal of the series as a whole, it's less of a linear argument, and it's more about trying to encourage a certain kind of attunement to the philosophical structure at work in some of these discussions. So I think they're often, as we talk about AI alignment and the future of humanity and a bunch of the issues that crop up in the context of AI, I think moving underneath that are a bunch of abstractions and philosophical views, and there's a bunch of stuff that I want us to be able to kind of excavate and see clearly and understand in a way that allows us to kind of choose consciously between the different options available, as opposed to just being structured unconsciously by the ideas we're using. So in some sense, the series isn't about like, here's my specific thesis. It's more about let's become sensitized to the structure of a conversation so that we can respond to it wisely. But as a result, the particular format of this lecture is going to leave out a decent amount of what I'm trying to do in the series. Part of the series is about its vibe. It's about sort of trying to communicate some subtle stuff. So I encourage you, maybe check out the series as a whole. You might get a different sense of what it is if you haven't read, for example, the reading for this week. You might be surprised based on the lecture as to what the series itself is like. I'll also say, my understanding is at least some folks in the audience are coming from more of a CS background or have a bit more of a technical orientation. That's great. In particular, I think, one thing that sort of orientation can do is put you in a position to help with some problems related to AI alignment and AI risk from a more technical dimension. And a thing I want to flag is I really think a lot of this issue is a technical problem and not a philosophy thing. So, I'm going to be giving a kind of very high level philosophy-ish story about a certain aspect and a certain ways of viewing this problem. But I really think at a basic level, a lot of it is about like, the kind of nitty gritty of how do we build AI systems? How do we understand our AI systems? How do we learn to predict their behavior? Ultimately, I think, and I think it can be easy actually because philosophy is kind of fun and kind of interesting, and it's more accessible. It's less kind of gnarly. It can be easy to kind of get distracted by the philosophy and to lose touch with the sense in which this is actually ultimately a technical problem. So I just want to flag that like this is going to seem like this is a bunch of philosophy, but I actually think not really. And in particular, to the extent you end up reacting negatively to some of the philosophical takes that I offer, I want to emphasize that these are not sort of the only angles that can lead you to care about AI systems not killing all humans. I think AI systems not killing all humans is actually, I think, a quite robust. You don't need a ton of fancy philosophy to get concerned about that if you think that that's a real possibility. And so, I'm talking about a particular set of philosophical assumptions that give rise to concern about that, but I don't think there's many others that would do the same. For example, I'm going to talk a bunch about like atheism, but if you're religious in various ways, you can still not want all of humanity to be killed by AI systems. And so, similarly, maybe you're a solipsist. You don't even believe other people exist, but you yourself might be killed by AI systems. Or maybe you care about that. So there's just like a lot of philosophy that a lot of philosophical views don't like being killed, including many that I won't discuss, but just flagging that up top. Okay, and then we'll I'll go for a while, and then this goes till 5:30. Is that right? Or sorry, 5:50.
Yeah, 5:50.
5:50, and then so hopefully we'll have some time for discussion as well. Okay, so diving in, this is the series in a single chart. You don't need to read this chart. Don't feel like, oh my God, I need to read this chart. I'm going to go through this chart in detail. But just to give you a sense of the roadmap where we're going, this is like the full thing that I'm going to say. Yeah. The chart will be online once I publish this, the lecture, but it's not right now. It's only here. But you will get a lot of exposure to this chart in the course of this lecture. And so in particular, I'm going to start with this first bit, which is my read of the AI risk discourse that I mentioned earlier, what I'm calling the Yudkowskian AI risk discourse. So we're going to zoom in on that to start with. And in particular, I'm going to zoom in on what I'm calling deep atheism. So deep atheism is the sort of the first premise in this overall dialectic. And deep atheism, as I'm understanding it, consists centrally of two components. So the first is some sort of atheism-like thing, which I'm calling naturalism. There's a lot of kind of subtlety in exactly how we're construing it, but a particular thing that is being denied by this component is something like the sort of thing that a traditional like Christian conception of God, or a kind of that underneath all of reality there is a perfect being, and that reality is in some sense structured by and explained by that being's nature and action, such that in some sense at the bottom of everything, reality and goodness are kind of fully unified. That is the thesis that it is most important in this context to deny. The claim is that that is not true. It is not the case that underneath everything is goodness. So that's the first claim, and then we can talk about sort of somewhat more specific stuff about reality is nature, what's nature. But if you need like a handle for this, like think about like what would Richard Dawkins think, or like take some like paradigm atheists, take their like broad cluster of vibes and metaphysics and stuff like that, and like roughly speaking, that's what I'm talking about here. And then the second component is what I'm calling moral anti-realism. Again, there's a bunch of different variants of that are in principle relevant here. The type that is most important to me, and this is actually compatible with certain types of moral realism, which gets confusing, but let's just leave that aside. The most important thing is that intelligent agents do not converge on the same values, even as they get smarter. So the picture I think that makes this most natural is to think that value, what is of value relative to a given agent, is that is grounded in the contingencies of that agent's psychology. So what you should do, what is sort of valuable relative to you is that's sort of a function of what you respond to in certain ways. And if you had a different agent, for example, an agent that cared a bunch about maximizing paperclips, that agent, it would not be the case that that agent would have the same thing that matters relative to it that matters relative to you. So there's a kind of subjectivism about value that's underneath this. I saw your hand. I'll get to that in a second. And then the thought is that contingency and that kind of difference between these agents that will persist even given various types of kind of enhancement or amplification to the intelligence and rationality of the agents at stake. So to get a sense, so for example, I don't know if any of you guys have ever done like the sorts of things that analytic ethicists tend to do. But basically what you do in philosophical ethics often is you take a bunch of intuitions that you have and you stitch them together, you try to make them more coherent, you try to like revise them in light of greater knowledge. There's a kind of process of reflection or reflective equilibrium, or there's some sort of way we reason to try to improve our ethics, like to try to gain better ethical understanding. The claim is not that that process doesn't go anywhere interesting or isn't productive. The claim is that process, the terminus of that process is still in an important sense relative to you. That when you do that, you go in a certain direction because you're like, oh, I care about people. I want to like think about like, do I care about people based on where they are in space or time? I'm not sure. And you go and you end up with some reflective ethic. But if you started by only caring about paper clips, that process, you'd be like, oh, like which things are paper clips exactly? Like, this is a different type of bent piece of metal. Is that a paper clip? You would be doing reflection, but it would go in some importantly different direction, or at least that's the claim. That's in contrast with stuff like if you think about where kind of naively how we tend to think about where different aliens, for example, would go in their conception of mathematics or physics. We tend to think that advanced civilizations will converge in their mathematical beliefs because in some sense they're responding to some objective structure. And so the claim is that value and ethics is not like that. This is importantly related to what's often called the orthogonality thesis in the context of AI risk. So this is roughly the claim that like the AIs, sure, they're going to be smart, but being smart just doesn't itself cause you to be morally enlightened in the way that we care about, right? If you take a chess playing engine and you make it like really, really good at chess, it's just not going to be like, at some point it's not going to go, you know what I should really do is like, I should maximize human flourishing, or I should like help the meek. It will just play, keep playing chess. And I think there's some intuition you can get for that if you think mechanistically about how values are implemented in minds. So roughly speaking, if you imagine values are implemented by there's some sort of like classifier of different states of affairs, and that classifier is like hooked up to your motivational system, such that like when a certain like thing is classified in a given way, that like causes that has like a connection with the behavior of the agent. I think like thinking about it mechanistically, you can get a sense for like, oh yeah, I guess I could just build an agent such that that process just kind of works for arbitrary things that are being classified, right? It's like I can just hook up arbitrary features of the AI's world model to its like actions, such that in some sense it'll be motivated by like any old thing. That's like one intuition for how you might get into this picture of how an agent's values work. Okay, so that was naturalism and moral anti-realism, and so these two combine along with various other vibes to create what I'm calling deep atheism. So basically, deep atheism is a kind of fundamental mistrust, both towards nature, because nature is indifferent, there's no like God underneath it, and then also towards stuff in the vicinity of like bare intelligence or mind or reason, right? So you might have thought like, the contrast here is like some people, there's a kind of like trust that they have in the universe. They're like, if I just like let the universe do its thing, then like things will go well. And deep atheism is like, nope, can't trust the universe. And then similarly, you can be like, but at least let me trust mind, let me trust the process of reason and understanding and whatever it is that you're amplifying when you think about more intelligent agents. Oops, you can't do that either, because those agents in some sense, those agents, they started out products of nature, and nature can't trust it. And then like really all you did was sort of amplify the direction that they're going, that you didn't. Yeah, so you're still stuck with the same old not God underneath, only this time smarter. And therefore scarier. Okay, there's a bunch to say about all this, so I'm going to try to move on, but this bit is going to keep cropping up. So if you have questions or objections, I think you'll probably be able to raise them later, and we can talk about the whole thing at the end as well. Okay, so the next concept I want to introduce is the distinction between yin and yang. You may have heard this distinction before. I am not going to be claiming that I'm using it in a like canonical way. In fact, I'm like centrally ignoring some of the traditional connotations of these terms. So this is like yin and yang sub Joe. But the particular aspect of yang that I want to isolate is basically an energy in the vicinity of like active, doing, controlling, right? And then the contrast is with yin, which is kind of receptive, not doing, letting go. So hopefully you can feel into roughly what that distinction is pointing at. And then the sort of claim I want to make, or the thing in some sense, one of the animating interests of the series is in the sense in which deep atheism prompts a kind of yang. So once you have become and it does that in a few different ways. So basically, first of all, yin, I think many types of yin involve a type of trust, right? Like, so insofar as you care about things being a certain way, but you are not exerting your agency towards making them that way, you're instead sort of letting go, being passive, not exerting agency, then you're kind of hoping that the other processes that are determining the thing are going to make it the way you want, or to make it good. But the problem is that deep atheism is sort of pretty low on trust in processes, period. Deep atheism is just stuff in the universe, agents, non-agents, it's all nature, none of it has God underneath. Why would you think it's good? And then there's some extra stuff depending on your values about things being kind of goodness being a very particular structure, right? In order for things to be good, you have to kind of arrange things in a particular way. And the default, if things are not arranged that way, is for things to be non-good, not necessarily bad. So I think to be actively bad is to be a particular way. You need to arrange things. Say you think suffering or something like that is bad. Then you need to exert agency. But I think deep atheism will think absent sort of the good agency exerted in the world, then things will be sort of some random way, some way that was not controlled. And most sort of random ways of being are kind of non-good. They're just kind of blank. It's and so a very simple model of this, if you imagine all of the matter in this room, and you're take all the different arrangements of the matter in this room, right? And now rank them in terms of neutral, good, and bad. The idea is the vast majority are going to be neutral. A few will be good, and if it's all these particular structures, happy humans, whatever you like. A few will be bad, people suffering, but most of them are going to be just random stuff. And that random stuff, that sort of vibe is the analog of the notion of paperclips. So when people talk about paperclips, it's not actually literal paperclips. It's the thought is if you're not sort of steering things in a very particular direction, your kind of default prior is that they're going to be kind of meaningless. They're going to be in some other direction, and if things aren't kind of curated in the right way, then that direction is going to be kind of neutral. That's a hazy intuition, is not at all an airtight argument, but that's that's an animating kind of vibe underlying the type of deep atheism I'm interested in, and it leads to quite a lot of kind of hesitation about just kind of letting go and letting things do their thing without you shaping them. There's also a kind of more particular type of mistrust that I haven't talked about as much. I could revise the notion of deep atheism to include this. I think it's possible. You should. But deep atheism is also, in particular, kind of suspicious of the types of letting go and yin involved in trusting kind of competition and bottom-up processes in which agents just compete to see who's the most powerful, or kind of there's various types of evolution is a bit like this. Capitalism, people sometimes this is related to the discourse about EAC, but there's a type of vibe is sort of the way to get good outcomes is to let kind of power decide, right? Let things compete, let them kind of bump up against each other, and then what will emerge from that is hopefully goodness on this picture. But oops, deep atheism doesn't trust that either. And why not? Well, roughly speaking, because the thing that wins competition is power. And power is unfortunately not the same as goodness. So in a competition, any chance you have to sacrifice goodness for the sake of power makes you more likely to win. The kind of ultimate, at least in the limit, competition is kind of decorrelated from goodness. That's a sort of general mistrust. This is related to the discourse about Moloch, if anyone has heard that term. But this means you can't. There's a sense in which deep atheism also tends to lead people to interest in a kind of the way you get good stuff is you can't just let stuff kind of from a bottom up upwelling kind of bump up against everything. Ultimately, there needs to be an agency kind of that is controlling stuff and pushing it in the good direction actively. And that is so that's something I associate at least with Yang and vibes in the vicinity of Yang. We can talk about that. This is in some sense importantly related to some of the live policy debates about AI risk, though at a super abstract level. So we can talk about that. And then finally, this is sort of a restatement, but basically nature and agents with different values can't be trusted to steer the universe. So the kind of the way you get goodness on this picture is you need agents with your values in particular to be steering things ultimately. And who has your values most? You do you even know those other people? So that's that's a sort of default towards your yang in particular, an interest in kind of your own agency. Okay. And then this is the part of the chart where it's like, all right, deep atheism, so yang, and then here it's sort of specific types of yang at stake. I mentioned, so there's like an aspiration to seek extreme power and control over the universe. There's kind of perceiving others with different values as a threat, because if they get power instead, then they'll take things in a different direction. And then in particular, I want to highlight this notion of the fragility of value, which is a concept that crops up in the context of the AI risk discourse. Which basically says it's sort of related to the thing I said about the different arrangements of atoms. So broadly, the vibe is that if you have value systems that are like kind of similar, at least in a restricted search space. So if you think about, I don't know, like libertarianism and utilitarianism in like the kind of current world, these might actually agree on like a decent number of like options when we have a kind of limited set of options available. But if you gave them the opportunity to like rearrange all the atoms in the universe into the optimal configuration, the claim is that these two value systems would like diverge much harder. And in general, that kind of intense optimization tends to cause, for like different utility functions or different value systems, tends to cause them to like decorrelate as the optimization pressure becomes more extreme. So this is related to a particular manifestation of what's sometimes called Goodhart's law. And again, I did not give any sort of like logically tight argument for that. And I think there's like a bunch to say about whether this is actually right. But this is another core intuition driving the AI risk, at least the traditional AI risk discourse, where the thought is something like, even if you gave an AI like kind of good values, like kind of okay values, it's like, actually, if you left something out or you got it slightly wrong, its concepts are kind of messed up, but then you like give it some incredible like godlike amount of oomph and intelligence such that it like maximizes the utility function that like emerges after some process of reflecting on the values you gave it, then like, you should be really scared of that maximization, because like it's just very hard to create a kind of target for optimization that is robust to like really, really intensive forms of it. So that's the fragility of value intuition. And so this dynamic is, roughly speaking, what causes folks like Yudkowsky to expect different types of like power seeking from AIs. So like when Yudkowsky sort of imagines you create a superintelligence, the superintelligence wakes up and it goes like, you know what I need to do my thing for a wide variety of things? I need power, resources, freedom. That's the what's often called the instrumental convergence thesis, that there's just like stuff that almost every agent wants once they sort of wake up and become sufficiently kind of oomphy. That stuff is basically yang. Like agents, they want yang. They want the ability to like exert their agency in the world. And they want to do it to a sort of extreme degree. And I was like, it's just like you wake up, you're like, oh shit, God's not going to maximize my utility. I have to do it. And AI is the same. Everyone the same. They all realize this. They're like, I got it. And so basically they're like, I need to get out there and exert control over the universe myself if I want things to go my way. And then others, then they're not pushing for my way. So in the human case, the worry is like the AI, it wakes up, it's like, the humans, they're like, I mean, there's different stories about why the AI might be sort of antagonistic to humans, but one is that the humans are kind of pushing in a different direction. The humans might try to shut the AI down. And so the AI needs to kind of prevent that. And then, in principle, the AI would look at human values and like, I don't like that. But then notably, note that this sort of story also applies to humans with respect to each other. And this is something that's less emphasized in the discourse. I think the AI risk discourse often treats humanity as a sort of unified value system. It's sort of like human values. There's a kind of, everyone's on the same team. It's kind of team humanity versus the AIs. But in principle, all of these arguments, the conceptual structure at least, applies to differences between human values as well. And in fact, if you take the fragility of value thesis seriously enough, then you end up thinking that like even very, very small differences between humans would lead to this fragility dynamic, such that like in principle, if you took like a super intelligent version of yourself and a super intelligent version of your best friend or your mom or whatever, and like took those utility functions and then maxed them out super hard. The story, or one story you might have, or you might wonder about, is whether you would get the same sort of dynamic if you bought it in the AI case, such that your mom or your best friend and you actually are kind of, you would create universes that would be equivalent to paperclips relative to the other person's values. So now, we could hypothesize that that's not the case about humans, that maybe. So if we go back to the convergence thing, you could soften this claim and say that some agents do converge on reflection. For example, humans claim, and we can wonder whether that's true. I don't think we've yet heard an argument for that being true. I don't know exactly how you would become confident that that's true. But that is one way to soften this and to sort of, you can say, and I think this is actually the somewhat implicit assumption underlying some of the I-risk discourse, is that in fact, this is like much more true of like kind of AIs relative to humans than humans relative to each other, in virtue of some like kind of way in which humans tend to converge or have sufficiently similar values. But that's an open question. I think at a conceptual level, the same arguments apply. Okay, so that is my summary of the philosophical structure of the Yudkowskian AI risk discourse. Okay. All right, let's move on, and then we can talk more. So let's move on to this part. So to some extent, the way this series ended up happening for me was, I spent a bunch of time with this discourse of roughly the type that I described. I'm sympathetic to a lot of aspects of this. I do think something like deep atheism, at least some flavors of it, look like pretty plausible. But I'm also I feel I feel something around how scary the type of vibe here can be, or like in particular the type of yang that I think this sort of discourse can give rise to. Seems like it has a number of quite salient failure modes. So I'll talk about a few of those here. One is sort of bad yang with respect to boundaries and cooperative structures. So like so an interesting aspect of the AI risk discourse is it often wants to kind of view humans and like paper clippers as kind of structurally analogous agents, right? It's like, you care about sort of different end outcomes, but ultimately you're the same like type of thing, doing the same type of game, namely competing for power. That is like the fundamental narrative. Agents, they compete for power, and that's just the game. But I think what that can lead to is sort of some like implicit assumption, or there's like a way in which the paperclipper is doing stuff that is just like unethical, irrespective of what it ends up doing with the universe. So it like kills everyone, or it like steals stuff, it overthrows governments. There's like basic cooperative structures that that the AI risk discourse often imagines the paperclipper to be violating. But note that the sort of instrumental dynamics that cause it to do that are actually independent of the thing that it values. So for example, this sort of issue crops up even in the context of like various human ethical views like utilitarianism, right? So the same sort of dynamic. I mean, the paperclipper is in some sense modeled off of a total utilitarian, just like has some material structure. It wants things to be that way. It happens to be paperclips. But even if it's pleasure or something that you really like, even if it's like optimal, happy humans running in like utopian, some like perfect utopia, this old saying, there's this quote, it's like, like the AI does not hate you, does not love you, but you're made of atoms that it can use for something else. And it's also true of utilitarianism, right? It's true of just like many, many ethics. For most ethics that are sort of consequentialist, just like the arrangements of matter in the world, they're just unlikely to be optimal kind of on their own. And so if the AI or if a human, if any sort of value system is in a position to like rearrange all the atoms, it's like probably not going to just keep the atoms in the way they were with all the fleshy humans, or at least that's the sort of concern. So basically I want to point to the sense in which like this broad vibe, the vibe that is giving rise to the paper clipping, and that would be sort of transferred to the humans if you just assume that humans are structurally similar, is in fact like very, very scary with respect to like how we think about boundaries and cooperative structures. You're invading people, all sorts of stuff, taking their resources. There's a bunch of stuff that is that just like pure yang, naive yang, I think does that's very bad. I've got Hitler invading. This is sort of a classic like violation of various boundaries. Then there's a subtler issue, which is more about specifically influencing, is yang exerted via influencing the values of other creatures, and in particular kind of people in the future. So the discourse about AI alignment in some sense. The fundamental structure says, okay, we really want the future to be good. The future is going to be driven by agency. It's going to be steered by agents on the basis of their values. And those values need to be my values. Because otherwise, the future is going to be steered in some other direction. And so the specific way in which I mean, they're either going to be they have to be your values on reflection. And so the kind of theory of change, in some sense, is to do something such that the agents in the future are optimizing for your values in particular. The kind of technical version of that, if you think that AIs are going to be like driving a lot of stuff, is to be aligning the AIs with your values, to sort of cause the AIs to have your values, or at least that's like one traditional conception. There's a bunch of subtlety here we can raise, but broadly speaking, the sort of the claim is kind of like you got to make sure that the future people have a specific set of values. And what's more, you're doing that if you're an anti-realist without any sort of intrinsic like authority. It's not like these values are like God's values or something like that. It's just, they're just kind of yours. It's you just kind of want things to be this way. And you're just kind of like just causing other agents to have your values too. And there's at least a vibe you can get into where that seems kind of tyrannical and problematic, that in some sense, and then you can worry in specifically like, how are you causing these these people or these AIs to have the values in question? Are you brainwashing them? Are you like getting, are you kind of conditioning them in problematic ways? And you can have that worry, I think, very saliently in the context of how we train AIs now. Even if we solved alignment, the way we currently treat AIs involves a bunch of treatment that would be, I think, viewed as ethically repugnant and unacceptable if it was applied to humans. And so including the sorts of things that you would do to try to make the AI's values be a particular way. So there's a concern about kind of tyranny towards the future, routing specifically by influencing the future's values. And I discussed that in a piece called On the Abolition of Man, which is responding to C.S. Lewis, who has a book about this. So those are two ways in which this sort of yang has like very salient failure modes. And then there's also, beyond these like specific articulations, I think there's just a bunch of other general heuristics and bad vibes. People who like really want a bunch of power and control, who like their main thing is like in some sense the AI is like, the AI, it wants to be like dictator of the universe. But that's just normal on this story. It's like, of course you want to be dictator of the universe. You're an agent. Why would you be less? Why would you want anything less? But actually, we tend to think that like wanting to be dictator of the universe in practice is kind of intense. That's like kind of scary. It's actually, there's something that it has like bad vibes about that. And I think it's at least worth noticing what's going on with that sort of hesitation, even if we don't yet have an articulation of what it is. Okay, so those are sort of salient failure modes. And then, so what I try to do in the series is talk about how I think we should respond to some of these failure modes and think about them going forward. A thing I think we should not do, which is sort of, I think, strangely tempting to do, is to conclude that deep atheism is false or that AI risk is unreal because it could justify scary behavior. I think this is like a quite common pattern of reasoning that people have where they're sort of like, there's some claim. They process that claim at the level of like, what could that claim be used to justify, or like, could that claim lead to like something bad? And then they conclude that the claim is false. And unfortunately, that's just not, or I don't know, unfortunately, that's not sort of how truth works, or it's just sometimes there are in fact true things that like could in principle be used to justify scary things, and that's just like a possibility that we need to deal with. And so I think there's like some dance in learning how to hold these possibilities in the right way. And I think we should not kind of reflexively be like, just like associative in our response and be like, oh, like this is a bad vibe, therefore the content, I don't need to engage with the content of whether something is true or not. I think of this saliently in the context of like, I would really like it if there were a perfectly good God underneath everything, for example, in the limit, like I think that would be great, but unfortunately you can't, I don't think that's true. And I think that might be true of other kind of more specific claims here as well. But I don't think that's the only option. So, roughly speaking, so I sort of talk, the sort of second half of the series, or maybe the last third, goes through like different elements of what I see as an important response to the types of failure modes I just discussed. In the context of the cooperation one, the sort of response that I want us to look for is to really attend to the parts of our ethics that have to do with negotiating differences in values amongst different agents. So in addition to like having stuff that we directly value, like we directly value people being happy or whatever, we also have this whole lived tradition as humans of dealing with competitions for power amongst different agents, of dealing with the ethics of exerting different types of control, dealing with like how do we divvy up like boundaries and resources and all this stuff, all of the sorts of things that are in principle at stake in the sorts of conflicts in values between like humans and AIs that the AI risk narrative is positing. This is actually old stuff. It's sort of intensified, but this is like conflicts for resources and power and differences in values. That's bread and butter of like human history, and we have a bunch of kind of lived wisdom about how to deal with that, at least within the specific constraints that we've had to deal with so far. In particular, I am interested in, so one is like niceness, which is like, there's a thing you can do, which is like you sort of care directly about some other people's values. That's like a thing you can do, or like give some space, you sort of be responsive to their values directly on their own terms. There's also sort of broader norms around liberalism and tolerance, right? So when we think about how we relate to different people with different values, like let's say, you're out there and you're listening to noise music, or even, it's like you're just like, you're hanging out in your backyard and you're just doing a very low value hobby. Like it's like you could have a way better hobby, right? It could be like way more pleasurable for you. We still just think like that's your thing. Like I don't get to go in there and be like, this matter, it could be arranged more optimally in your backyard. It's like, nope, the backyard, that's like for you. Now that doesn't mean that you can like torture people in your backyard, right? So we have actually like subtle structure about like which sorts of boundaries warrant what sorts of respect. But like for a large variety of kind of differences in values, we think like that what we do, the way we handle that is we sort of divvy things up, we establish like norms, and then we leave people alone. And I think there's a sense in which the sort of AI risk discourse is like nothing will be left alone, everything will be like optimized, and I think that's not actually how we've handled this issue in the past. There's a bunch of other liberal norms I think are relevant. Property rights, a bunch of stuff, and boundaries is another way of sort of generalizing what that means. So that's like one piece. I think like attending to both the ethical dimensions of the sort of liberal and deontological and kind of niceness-based aspects of our ethics. And also, I think this is also like there's a reason we have this stuff that's not just about our intrinsic values. I think this is also in many cases a sort of powerful way of causing cooperation and conflict resolution between agents. So I think there are also instrumental reasons to be interested in why we have norms of this kind, reasons that might continue to apply in the AI case. We can talk more about that if you like. Maybe I'll hop over here. So that was like my response to the here I have the. So you can see it's like my response to Bad Yang. This is like do niceness, liberalism, boundaries. So my response to Bad Yang, influencing the values of others, is like basically, you got to like attend to it. You got to really think about it. You can't just be like, I am like, I shall just cause the future people to have my values in whatever way. You need to actually think about like, well, we have a bunch of norms around like what is it to shape people's values in ethical and unethical ways. Brainwashing, not good. Like rational debate, good. And there's like a question of like how can we reconstruct those norms in a way that's robust to sort of various types of meta-ethical considerations, including the moral anti-realism stuff. But I think there's like a bunch of rich structure in our like lived ethics that a kind of naive Yang about influencing the values of others doesn't capture. And I think that needs to be at stake in how we think about creating AIs today. I think, as I said, I think we are currently doing stuff to AIs that would be totally unacceptable if done to humans. I think it's like plausible that AIs at some point will be moral patients in a way that makes it genuinely unacceptable to do it to them, or at least like such that there's a strong pro tanto moral objection to doing it to them. And I think we need to just actually stare that in the face and figure out what trade-offs we are making and why, and whether that's the right thing to do. And then finally, I want to talk about green. So this is sort of the end of the series. So green is a term that I borrow from my version of the Magic the Gathering color wheel. I don't play Magic myself, but I have read some people who play a bunch of Magic and who are interested in like the kind of typologizing energies that animate people and institutions and all sorts of stuff in the following way. There are these 5 colors: white, blue, black, red, and green. My summary of the shtick, though again, this is like my opinionated summary, people have different ways of doing this, is like, the vibe of white is about morality, the vibe of blue is about knowledge, black is about power, red is about passion, and then green is about, and then this is the essay is about like trying to flesh out in kind of clearer terms what green is. So associations with green include environmentalism, tradition, family, spirituality, hippies, stereotypes of Native Americans, Yoda, humility, wholesomeness, health, and yin. So I don't know if that like pins something down for anyone. It's sort of broad list. I don't know if anyone like is a Miyazaki fan, but Miyazaki is just like incredibly green. There's a bunch of stuff that's green. Children's movies are often quite green. Okay, so paradigm forms of deep atheism, I think, can be quite opposed to green. And I think like in some sense, like the rationality discourse, it just like kind of doesn't, it either sort of doesn't know what green is, or it thinks like green is one of these like mistakes. So for example, like a lot of the AI risk discourse, like Boström and Yudkowsky were heavily influenced by also the discourse about longevity and about whether we should be trying to cure death. And like a thing people will say about death is like, you should like let go. You're like being too like yangy about death. Death is a part of life. Death is a part of nature, etc. And like I think like that's an example of a place where people are like, this is green. These people are way too green. They can't like see that we need to like this is just like a bad thing and we need to change it. It's not like, oh, nature has no sacredness. This is actually just bad. And I think there's a sort of more generalized version of that mistrust that I think deep atheism can have. See also, like, I don't know, like wild animal suffering is another one that comes up here, where people are like wild animal suffering is part of life. And then there's a different perspective where you're like, oh, actually wild animal suffering, sorry, it's just bad. You could just stop it. And if you were like, no, this is like sacred, you're seeing things wrong. But so, and I think there's a bunch to this sort of critique of green. And I think green sort of, especially sort of simplistic forms of green, I think can be really off. But I actually think that various aspects of green are pretty important here, and I think I want to make sure we are like attuned to them and able to incorporate them into our response to the AI situation. In particular, I talk in a series about kind of having notions of respect that don't route via having the same values as someone, but that also don't route by just thinking they're like smart or competent. There's like some other form of respect that I want to like think about there. I think there's a way in which certain sort of green-based vibes actually take like joy in not in sort of yin, like not joy in kind of encountering something that you don't control, and like dancing with it. There's a sense of like joy in not having everything. Whereas I think like deep atheism has a kind of, the assumption is like, obviously the best thing is to have like arbitrary power and control, because then you can like shape things according to your will. Whereas I actually think that's like not how our values are structured. And then also I talk about some notion of attunement, which is, I have an essay about attunement, which I think of as a kind of responsiveness to the world that kind of is able to kind of take in various types of meaning and value. So I think I basically, the two penultimate essays in the series are about green and about ways in which I want the vibe of green to be like incorporated into our response to AI. But I think we should not overcorrect, right? So I think like we also need to stay in touch with what's true about deep atheism as we deal with this issue. So in particular, I talked in the beginning. The series sort of opens with examples of like this example of this guy Timothy Treadwell, who is like aspires to be very like gentle and kind of yin and green towards like grizzly bears. He's an environmental activist, and then he gets eaten alive by one of the bears. And I use it as an analogy of kind of ways in which we could approach AI from a perspective of like, we are going to be like very green and gentle and nice, and forget the sense in which the sort of deep atheist point that like AIs can just be actually quite alien and they can be alien even as they are worthy of respect, even as they are moral patients. They can also just kill you brutally the way a bear can, and we need to remember that. Also, like general things, like I think bad things are bad. They're not good. They're not sacred. Bad things are bad. And so that's important to remember. I think that like raw indifference and coldness of nature is important to remember. Black, which is the sort of like power yang, I think is great in lots of ways. I think it's okay to exert certain types of intentional influence on the future, including on the values of future agents, modulo like a bunch of ethical subtlety. I'm a fan of a certain kind of deep atheism, which I call in the last essay humanism. And part of humanism is like the idea that human agency can actually like make the world better. So I don't know, like if you think about smallpox, this is an example of smallpox. It's bad. It was natural, in some sense, like a very naive form of green, has a tough time distinguishing between like curing cancer and ending death and stuff like this. I just think like smallpox, we cured it. We did that. We can do that kind of thing more. We can make gentle the life of this world, and much more than that. And And then finally, I think there's a way in which our choices, like a simple form of deep atheism sort of imagines it's like there's reality over here, there's God over there, and then there's us kind of like rebelling or kind of standing against God. But I think there's a sense in which we are actually like part of God's nature, and our choices are themselves the creation of God's nature. So like we don't actually, we get to choose some part of like who God is. And I think so we can, if we want God to be good or at least better, then we should choose well. So that's a bunch of stuff. Yeah, I think that's basically a summary of the whole series. And we've got about 20 minutes for questions. So I've just thrown up, here's the whole chart. So, you know, hopefully, yeah, you now feel more familiar with it. And yeah, so maybe let's just talk about anything that's come up. Thanks very much.